Welcome to the Michael Shermer Show. I'm your host, Michael Shermer. My guest today is Lee McIntyre. His new book is How to Talk to a Science Denier: Conversations with Flat Earthers, Climate Deniers, and Others Who Deny Reason. Lee McIntyre is a research fellow at the Center for Philosophy and History of Science at Boston University. He's the author of Dark Ages: The Case for a Science of Human Behavior, Post-Truth, and The Scientific Attitude: Defending Science from Denial, Fraud, and Pseudoscience, all published by MIT Press, as is this book. So we have quite an interesting conversation about how do you even define science denial, since no one in the history of the world has ever considered themselves to be science deniers. Everybody thinks they have science on their side, so how do we know the difference? How does science operate? How do you define it? How do we determine what's reliable knowledge or not? In other words, that line of demarcation. And then we go through his adventures at the Flat Earth Society convention, which is quite amusing. But he really shows that, these people, they are smart, they are logical, they have arguments. And, so the question is how best to engage somebody that has those kind of arguments. And then from something as fringy as the Flat Earth, we get into the anti-vaxxers, anti-GMOers, climate deniers, and other, slightly more important topics for our society. And then we kind of wrap up on what some of the guiding principles are for how to talk to somebody who, has gone down this path. Like, for example, if you have an upcoming dinner with your crazy Uncle Bob, who's a QAnon person or whatever, what do you say? How do you talk to them? And so Lee gives us some really good advice on that. All right. Thanks for listening and enjoyed this conversation. Before I introduce today's guest, I want to tell you about our sponsor, Wondrium. Here's the little app on my phone. You just touch it like that. It opens right up to lots and lots of content. Of course, you can access this online as well. It's a subscription system. It's the old great courses, now expanded to be called Wondrium, that includes documentary series and other educational programs besides just the great courses. And their lectures, which, as you know, if you've listened to the show, I love. I consume them constantly. I've produced a couple myself. Here's the latest one I'm listening to. This one is called World War II, Up Close and Personal. Experience the startling realities of the Second World War through the eyes of the people who lived them. So I'm almost done. Actually, I think I had 3 more lectures to go in this particular course. This is 24 lectures. Each of them are about 30 minutes long. I listen to them at 1.25 speed, so that's about 20 minutes per lecture. So here are some of the lectures, just great. Hitler and the Nazi Youth, Japanese soldiers in Nanjing, Panza leaders who changed warfare, Jews inside the Warsaw Ghetto, the besieged in Leningrad, the bomber will always get through. Let's see, the submarine, what it's like to be on a U.S. submarine, and the eyes and ears of war correspondents, what it's like to be a kamikaze pilot. What were these people thinking? Anyway, this is a great course. I love it. So you can access this through my podcast for free for a month. And it's so if you go to the wondrium.com/Shermer, you get the free month trial. And so give it a try. It costs nothing. It's free for the first month, and you can access just thousands and thousands of pieces of educational material that's well worth listening. So check it out. Again, go to Wondrium, wondrium.com/Shermer, and you get your free trial. All right. Thanks for listening.
Thanks for having me on the show. So I was born in Portland, Oregon, lived there until I was 18, then came out to the East Coast, went to Wesleyan University. Met my wife, first person I met on the first day, and so I was an Easterner ever since. I've lived out on the East Coast ever since. And I got interested in philosophy when I was in college, read Karl Popper my sophomore year, and sort of decided then and there that I was going to become a philosopher of science. And from there, I went to graduate school at University of Michigan, studied, all the things that philosophers study, but you still knew that I wanted to be a philosopher of science because I just couldn't get over the question of demarcation. I just couldn't get over this issue of how science was different than other ways of knowing. And in some way or another, I've spent really my whole career interested in this. But what happened is people started to attack science. this thing that I loved so much. I mean, I initially got into philosophy of science because I wanted to make the social sciences more scientific. I wanted to expand the sciences. And then I found that I really needed to defend the sciences because so many people were coming after it. And then ultimately that led to several books, one called Respecting Truth and one called The Scientific Attitude, where I was really interested in making a contribution to this idea of what was special about science. But as I was out on the road talking about that book, I kept getting the question from the audience, so what can we be doing? We would agree with you. What can we be doing to defend science? And I said, well, go out and talk to people who disagree with you. And then I realized that I needed to do that because even though I was going to rural Georgia and, Nebraska, I was talking to people at the universities. I was talking with people who already agreed with me. And I wanted to get out and see what it was like to actually talk to science deniers. And once I did, it was an incredible experience. And I knew I needed to write a book about that now, which is the book that you just held up, because I realized that a lot of what I'd done in the past was theory, and now I needed to do some practice. And that's what the new book is about.
Yeah, interesting. I just had Michael Gordon on the podcast. He's got a book about this demarcation problem as well. And he has one of my favorite quotes I use in my lectures on pseudoscience, in which he says, no one in the history of the world has ever identified as a pseudoscientist. Gets up in the morning, says, well, I'm going to go down to my pseudo lab and collect some pseudo facts to support my pseudo theory. Of course, everybody thinks they're doing science. So, and I would apply the same question or statement to your book. No one in the history of the world has ever identified as a science denialist. They all think, well, I have science
absolutely.
on my side. You guys are on the wrong side. Right. Or in my case, they always say, Shermer, you're skeptical about the wrong thing. The skepticism should go the other direction. Yeah. You should be a good skeptic. You're an ideological skeptic. I'm like, okay. So let's get down to so how do you know the difference between good science and bad science, or pseudoscience or non-science, or pathological science? There's so many different words. Science denial.
Yeah. It was tough because I really crossed this bridge in my last book, in The Scientific Attitude, because I finally figured out that it really couldn't be done in a logical sense, in a methodological sense, in a formal sense. You can't come up with a set of necessary and sufficient criteria which are going to sort all and only science on one side and all and only non-science, or however you want to identify it, on the other side. But the thing that had really motivated me from the beginning was this idea of what's special about science and how to use that to defend science. And I discovered that you don't need to solve the demarcation problem to do it. In fact, all of the focus on the demarcation problem for the last 100 years in the philosophy of science has sort of distracted the philosophers from being as useful as they could be, during the science wars, or, during the, deniers attacking science, or pseudoscientists. I mean, they tend to be interested in it, but they're not out there doing things about it. And so when I wrote The Scientific Attitude, I wanted to defend the idea that science was special, but what was special about it was the attitude toward inquiry, that scientists care about evidence and they're willing to change their mind based on new evidence. And that's really the core idea. I kind of got it from Karl Popper, even though he wanted to, solve the formal demarcation problem, in a logical way. I decided that we don't really need to do that in order to understand what's special about science and to defend it. And from there, I used what I thought was important about science, the scientific attitude, to just start to engage with science deniers, to start to talk with them and probe what their attitude was toward evidence and why it was, a problem that they didn't seem to be reasoning on the basis of evidence. I mean, they weren't following good reasoning tactics. So, because you've spoken to them more than I have, I'm sure, when you talk to a science denier, they will claim that it's about evidence. And yet any evidence you share with them, they're not going to accept it. What's really wrong is their reasoning strategy. And so to answer your question, what's different about pseudoscientists or science deniers, it's their reasoning strategy. It's the fact that although they profess to care about evidence, what they've really got is a double standard where anything that they want to believe, they'll cherry pick what evidence they need. Anything they don't want to believe, no evidence could convince them. And then they'll say, oh, I'm a skeptic.
Right. Or just asking questions. That actually has a phrase
just
called
asking questions. Yeah.
Jacking. He's jacking off. He's just asking questions, like Columbo. I just have just one more question. Just one more question.
Just one more question.
But of course, it's all directed towards some particular strategy. Yeah, there are.
We can use that too, though. Remember?
Yes, of course.
We can use that too.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So, and let's go back, since you started with Popper, this idea of falsification. Is that enough, or do we actually reason in a more Bayesian, positive probability ways in which we try to build evidence in favor of a theory, not just try to falsify it? And if it's not falsified, then, well, it's something, I don't know what. You have to have some positive evidence as well as not negative evidence.
I'm more or less agnostic about how, scientists are in this dither with one another, and especially philosophers of science, over how you should properly reason. This big debate in statistics over, Bayes versus all the other approaches. And I have a very slim, very pared down view to defend science, which is that you have to care about evidence. Now, the next question is, so how do you reason on the basis of that evidence? And then, then we're off to the races again as philosophers. But I'm really not trying to solve that. I'm going to remain agnostic about how we reason on the basis of evidence, because that feels to me like getting mired in the logical questions again, when what I really think is necessary at this point in my career is to make a difference for science. Get out there and change some minds about science denial, about pseudoscience. In my heart and soul, I'm probably a falsificationist. I've told you I read Karl Popper from the beginning, and that bit pretty deeply. But I think that he used it incorrectly in trying to make it a logical criteria of demarcation. Because when you get down to it, that's not really how scientists reason. That's maybe the after the fact way that we justify it in a logical sense once, we look at the theory, but it's not how scientists actually do it. And in my opinion, science deniers have been clubbing us over the head for decades now with claims about science having to be perfect. It has to offer proof or certainty. They really don't understand how scientists reason. And I don't think we can come back against that with some argument about falsifiability. Though I did have a lot of luck speaking with science deniers myself, asking them a very Popperian question, which is, what evidence, if I had it in my back pocket, could get you to change your mind? Because if they couldn't answer that question, they didn't have the scientific attitude. So I think Popper was on the right track. And that's where that question comes from. That's where the scientific attitude comes from.
Yeah, I always like to use what I call Sagan's dragon from Demon Haunted World, where he says, I have a dragon in my garage. Would you like to see it? And like, yeah, that would be super cool. So you open the garage door and you look around. There's some paint cans and an old bicycle and a ladder and so on, but I don't see any dragon. Well, okay, this is an invisible dragon. Oh, an invisible dragon. Well, all right. So how about we spread some flour on the ground and then we'll catch its footprints? Well, you see, this dragon hovers above the ground about 6 inches and it's invisible. Okay. Well, I have one of these heat detecting things that we use during COVID, right? I can point it and get the temperature of something. So I'll point it. You just show me where the dragon is and we'll get the body temperature. Well, this is actually a cold-blooded dragon. It doesn't give off any body heat. Well, what about the fire? It's a fire-breathing dragon, right? The fire's good. Well, this is special cold fire. In other words, at some point, what's the difference between an invisible, hovering, cold-blooded, cold-fire dragon and no dragon at all? And that's the falsification thing. There has to be some way to test it, or else you're just asserting things without evidence. And as Christopher Hitchens famously said, that which can be asserted without evidence can be dismissed without evidence. Now, but if say, let's flip it. Let's say we did get some footprints, kind of. You could sort of barely make it out. And the temperature thing, it looked like there was a reading, maybe, but maybe it was the sun coming through the window. So I start to build some positive evidence that my dragon is there. But you're like, I don't know, that heat spike could be from the sunroof or, whatever. And then you get into, well, what constitutes quality evidence in support of your particular hypothesis? And that's where it gets trickier.
It does get trickier, but at that point, I think you are talking about evidence. And the key there is to be able to say in advance what would count, right? So rather than you just proposing, oh, well, we put down flour, we could do this, we could do that, have them say, what, or they should get you to say what would in advance, because then you can do a crucial test, right? So that's the frustrating thing. I mean, the dragon thing reminds me of my conversations with flat earthers, right? Every time you say something, then it's, oh, no, that wouldn't count. Well, what about the moon landing? No, that didn't happen. Well, why not? Well, because there's a dome. How do you know there's a dome? Well, because there has to be. There's always an excuse for everything. And what works, I think, is to be able to say, well, tell me in advance how we should test this. How do you think we should test this? And then, if somebody's willing to say that, then I think they're on firmer ground. I think here of the, I'm sure that, the Princeton Engineering Anomalies Lab, where, they were able to say in advance what would count and tried to measure it, which made it more interesting, right? At that point, I don't think that's a non-scientific claim. I think it's interesting. Now, their data were pretty sparse, and even the sparse data that they had maybe could be explained in other ways, and maybe there were some methodological problems in the way that they measured it. But the thing that I respected about that is that I think they were working in good faith to try to say, well, what would you have us do? And can we get some peer review here? To work with the people who were skeptical of what they were doing, rather than just jumping headlong into belief, which, looks an awful lot like faith. There's a line there. And I pursue this a little bit in the scientific attitude. What's on the scientific side of the line and what isn't. Maybe we still got a demarcation problem here at some level. But I think that we can't just rule everything out because it sounds implausible if there's some evidence. Then we have to go in and maybe do some myth busting and maybe figure out why their equipment was flawed or what really explains what they saw. But then they have to be willing to accept it and give up their view, which does not happen.
Yeah, that's a terrible thing. I recall the Nrays affair back, I think it was in the 30s or 40s or something like that. If X-rays are real, how about these Nrays that were radiating out of the Earth or something like that? Anyway, the equipment that the experimenters were using included like a little prism or something that was reflecting the Nrays off into the camera that was devising it or whatever, and they kept getting these barely statistically probable hits or whatever. Anyway, the skeptical investigator, when the experimenters weren't looking, reached in and took the prism out so it wouldn't work, and they were still getting the effect. So it's like, okay, so whatever's going on here, it's not Nrays, it's something else, right? But just to kind of reflect on the crisis, the so-called replication crisis that we're going through in mainly the social sciences and medical sciences. I mean, this began with Daryl Bem's famous experiment about backwards causality. This ESP, apparently subjects could, sitting before a computer screen with two windows that would then, release or reveal one picture, either a kind of an emotionally stimulating one, pornography was their choice, of course, or a neutral one. And they had this database of images that were known to evoke emotions or not. And anyway, this got published in a prestigious journal by a renowned experimental psychologist, Daryl Bem. And so, of course, people came to us, skeptics, and said, hey, you've been saying for decades that if we could publish in a peer-reviewed journal by a renowned experimentalist, you would believe. All right, well, do you believe? And I'm like, well, give me some time. So anyway, a bunch of us kind of dissected it. The heavy lifting was done by Ray Hyman, who went through the methodology very carefully, and then Stuart Ritchie and that British psychologist and magician Richard Wiseman tried to replicate it, and they couldn't replicate it. And Ray Hyman found that, in fact, Bem had run 9 experiments, and just the one was statistically significant, and barely, like 51% versus 49%, and that's the one that got reported. So, of course, the file drawer problem. So your point would be you have to tell us ahead of time which one you're going to count, not after the fact. You pick the ones that ended up being significant and file drawer the rest, and we don't even know what you did.
Yeah, they did. What do they call that? Degrees of freedom, right? I mean, if you're right on that edge, not fraud, but right on that edge of what you're going to report, what are you not? Are you going to keep the study open until you get the data that you want? You're going to close it the second you get the data that you want. A little bit of p-hacking. You can come up with some amazing things. It just occurred to me as you were describing that experiment, that's the one that they were making fun of in Ghostbusters, right? Wasn't that the...
oh, you mean the remake? The I didn't see the remake. But yes, it's something like that.
The original...
the original one with the Zener Cards. Yeah.
The original one he was holding with the cards,
the Zener Cards.
The telepathy card.
And the reason for the Zener Cards is because you need an operational definition of what would constitute a hit. So psychics typically say just these generalizations. I'm getting this person here, feels like a grandfather to me or a father figure. Who is this? And then, this is my uncle. Oh, yes. Well, your uncle was a father figure. I count that as a hit. So the point of the Zener Cards is it's either a triangle, a circle, a square, or the wavy line, or the star. And there's no, I'm kind of getting these lines that are sort of bending. No, that's it. So, and this is the problem, with a lot of experiment. It's hard to specify exactly what would constitute a hit when you're dealing with like complex medical issues or something like that, where it's never 100% or 0%. Anyway, but let's go back to the start of your book, because this is, I love this first chapter. Your adventures among the flat earthers. What on earth possessed you to go to a flat earth conference, and what was that like?
I wanted to see the worst of the worst. I wanted to, if I was going to go out and talk with science deniers, I wanted to talk to the science deniers that even other science deniers were going to ridicule. And the reason was because I had a hypothesis that all science denial reasoning was the same, and that if I could figure out how to talk to a flat earther, that would enable me to kind of, in its most elemental form, figure out what the conversation should be, and then I could use it, that the same techniques that I learned in conversation, to talk to climate deniers and anti-vaxxers and others. So I bought my ticket to Flat Earth. It was out in Denver, Colorado in November 2018. And I had my, my flannel shirt, and I was going to go incognito. That whole 2-day conference, and that whole first day, I was incognito because I just wanted to listen. And I have to say, your article from Scientific American, the one where you talked, I forget the name of it, but the one where you talked about when facts fail, that was the one, where you have to be calm, and you have to listen, and you have to be respectful. That is what I did. I was so respectful that I kind of didn't open my mouth that whole first day and just listen to them. And what I learned is that a lot of it's patter and repetition, and that, there's not really much behind it. How could there be? So that when I came out the second day and started to question it, and not question it in the way to say, what are you people crazy? We've been to the moon. What about this picture? Because they were ready for that. Instead, I had been able to identify some flaws in their reasoning and use that, which was felt good. And my goal in going in wasn't necessarily to convert somebody, though that would have been great. But to learn what I could say to them, really how to get them to listen. And the key was, if I listened to them, then they really turned out to be interested in what I had to say, especially since they had initially thought that I was one of them. It was a searing experience to be in a ballroom with 650 people who all believe the earth is flat. And I was maybe one of, 5-10 people in the room who didn't, because, the first hour the press were there. And then, they give the speeches from the stage, about the press, don't just do a hit and run. Don't just record this first session and then leave, for your TV. Really stay here and learn what we're saying. Well, of course, they didn't. They left. And then they closed the doors and said, "It's just us now."
Oh,
and
boy.
I thought, what the hell's about to happen? This is, but at that point, I might have been the only globalist, they call them globalist, in the room. And I just learned a ton. And it was searing. It was weird to be, I felt that pressure of that conformity pressure. It's not like they were going to convert me, but it is psychologically destabilizing to be in a room of people who all think you're crazy. And that's what they thought. They thought I was crazy.
Once they figured out who you were, did they try to convert you? I mean, were they friendly and respectful? And did they think, oh boy, here's our chance to test our ideas on Skeptic?
They were impressed, though they didn't say it in that way. I think they were impressed that I had been there amongst them for the whole first day. I mean, I don't think they expected that. So they were kind of, I'll say, surprised. But then once they heard that, then yes, they were respectful. They did want to hear what I had to say, but they did say, oh, now be careful, because we used to be like you. Everybody in here was a globalist. And then we started to question things, went on YouTube. YouTube was, how it's done, how the conversion, came across. And they all had some experience in their life that caused them to question things. For a lot of people, it was 9/11, and they thought, well, 9/11 was an inside job. And if that's true, what else are they lying to us about? And then they, landed on flat earth, went down the rabbit hole, as they say, right? But yeah, they wanted to engage me. They wanted to convert me. That, I think, is what they wanted to do. And they thought, well, here you are amongst us. We have a pretty good track record. You must be here because you're interested in what we have to say, which you just proved the first day. So now we're going to convert you. And that was actually quite interesting, because when I let them try to convert me, they would reveal more holes in their argument, which I then could just be skeptical of and, see what they had.
What were some of their arguments?
So just demographically, about 3/4 of them, maybe more, are evangelical Christians. But they did not use that as an argument. At least the people from the stage tended not to. So some of them did. I think of it that they were trying to make flat earth consonant with their Christian faith, but they would say that their faith was not why they were a flat earther, that they believed it on the basis of evidence. And so they had talks one after another. I mean, they had musical acts. They had film, the speakers, a debate. It wasn't really a debate. But one of my favorite presentations was a fellow who claimed to be this was the great scientific presentation of the FEIC, Flat Earth International Conference. And he started off by saying that he wasn't a scientist, he didn't have any scientific training, but he did have a white lab coat. He held up a white lab coat, and that was all the authority that he needed. And then he went on to just kind of give a dog's breakfast of all the different anomalies that he purported to find in the idea of the global Earth, then mixed in with some things that he thought made the argument for flat Earth. And I have to say, if you go in there not really, if you're not a physicist, which I'm not, there are some arguments that they have that you understand are wrong, but you can't quite put your finger on exactly what's wrong. He was talking about the Coriolis effect for 15 minutes. I didn't remember enough about the Coriolis effect to understand why what he was saying was, even supposed to be coherent based on what he said, let alone refute it. But one of his best arguments was that he had a picture that he showed up on the screen of the city of Chicago from 60 miles away out in Lake Michigan, which at that point, given the curvature of the Earth, you shouldn't be able to see. And, this to me was fascinating because he had just gotten done saying that every picture from NASA was faked, which led me to wonder why he trusted that picture. So this was when I came out. He came off the stage and he was surrounded by his fans. And I said, I have a couple questions for you about your presentation. He said, sure. He thought I was one of them at that point. But then I started to ask him questions like, how are you sure that picture wasn't faked? And he said, well, he knows the guy who took it. And I said, and he said, but I went out on Lake Michigan myself and verified it. And, in fact, you only need to go out 46 miles. And I said, well, now that's interesting because I had a little calculation there that, it had been 46 miles. So he wasn't an incompetent mathematician. But, he said, look, how else could you explain this? And I said, well, what about the superior mirage effect? And he said, well, I discussed that in my talk. And I said, no, you didn't. You just said you didn't believe in it. And the superior mirage effect is the idea that this was a piece of physics that I did remember, that if you've got a cold surface and then a hot surface on top of it, the light will be bent. Okay. So what you're actually seeing, so the picture was not faked. What you're actually seeing is an image of the city of Chicago projected into the sky because the light is bent given the temperature gradient between those two surfaces. And it's a really cool effect, which I've now seen, many times. You can even take a video of it, the blinking lights of the transmitter over the horizon. It's a really cool effect because it's, this image that's projected. And we've all seen the inferior mirage effect. We've all seen, driven on hot pavement. The pavement is blisteringly hot and the air is not as hot. And it looks like there's water on the pavement. So, we've all seen that. We've seen an image projected down, and the superior mirage effect is when an image is projected up. And, he just wasn't having it. He said, no, this is all, fake. This is the scientists, they faked this. They're in cahoots with the devil. They want you to believe that. It's all conspiracy theory. So, and here was my Popperian question. I said, why didn't you go? Okay, so you were at 46 miles and you saw this. And he said, yes. And I said, why didn't you go out 100 miles? And he said, why would I do that? And I said, well, because think about it. If you went out 100 miles and the superior image disappeared, right? Then I'm right. But if it didn't disappear, then you're right. So there you had a crucial experiment right in your hand. If you'd just gone out another 50 some miles, you could have tested your theory and made a fool of me because, you say the city of Chicago would have still been there. I say it would not have been there. And he said, we couldn't get the captain of the boat to go out that far, which is kind of like you're putting the flower with the dragon, right? He waited until I proposed it. And then he said we couldn't get the captain of the boat to go out. He didn't initially say, oh, we tried to go out and test. He waited until I said, there was your crucial test. And then he had a reason why it wouldn't work. So I had these sorts of conversations all weekend. And, at a certain point, I kind of had to take a break. But for the most part, people were just happy to chat and thought I was either in cahoots with the devil or I was under the influence of people who were.
So as a reasoning strategy, their approach was what I guess we call anomaly hunting. If the globalists are right, then how do you explain boom, 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 and they have a list of a dozen or 24 or whatever, what they consider to be anomalies. Right. I mean, this is what creationists do. Yeah. Richard Dawkins says it's a funny story about, if I can't explain the evolutionary origins of the left elbow of the spotted green tree frog in Amazon, then creationism is true. Right. Even though there probably is an explanation for this, but even if there wasn't, because no theory explains everything, there's always going to be anomalies. So their first approach is that if globalism is true, then how do you, globalist, explain all these things? But then do they flip it and go, here is positive evidence in favor of the flat earth theory?
They do. And the evidence in favor of flat earth theory tends to be first-person observation. So they will have, my favorite here was the fella who flew in to Denver with a carpenter's level on the tray table in the airplane sitting in front of him. And because that bubble didn't dip, except during takeoff and landing, he thought that proved that the Earth was flat. So that's the level, of evidence that we're talking about. I mean, they will, and they will run experiments. But here's the problem.
Hang on
they
for a second.
They don't live by those experiments.
So the little bubble thing that carpenters use, if the Earth is curved and so the plane is like doing this, the bubble should be moving.
He thought it would be falling. He thought that so if the Earth is round and he was flying from Europe or wherever, that at a certain point the plane would be falling.
I see.
And when the plane was falling, that bubble would move.
I see.
But because the bubble never moved the entire time, that proved that it was flat. Now, they don't understand that water can undergo gravitational attraction, I don't think. Another thing that they would say is water can't adhere to a spinning ball. And my answer was, well, it can if the ball is big enough. I mean, you try it with a beach ball, throw a cup of water at it. No, but if the ball's big enough. So, I mean, they did have various things like this, some of which were just bull. I mean, they would have things like, and I can't even piece this together from memory. The one of their pieces of evidence that the scientific speaker used was that there were 3 6s in Walt Disney's signature, which if you ever look at Walt Disney's signature now, you're not going to be able to unsee this.
Okay.
There are 3 6s in Walt Disney's signature. Well, why is that relevant? Because they claim that Walt Disney did the animation for the moon landing and that had been in cahoots with Werner von Braun in some way, and that they had both been influenced by the devil in order to do this. And so if that weren't true, why are there 3 6s in Walt Disney's signature? So, as I said, it was a dog's breakfast. It was about 100 different things, which every time you had an answer to one of them, and then they couldn't push it any further, they'd say, okay, but what about? And they'd move to a different one.
Yeah. Yeah, in your book, you make that distinction between, content rebuttal versus strategy rebuttal? I forget the terms you used.
Technique rebuttal, yeah. That wasn't mine. That was an experiment.
Oh, yeah. I was thinking about that because...
was a paper...
I was thinking about that with the problem, if you're going for a point-by-point rebuttal of their arguments, is you got to be really prepared for each of those particular claims. Like, because when I got into this whole business in the late 80s, early 90s, I watched some creationist debates and I watched some Holocaust denier debates, and the biologists or historians looked really bad because they thought the debate was about biology, evolutionary biology, or they thought, I'm a Holocaust historian. I know how the Holocaust happened, but the debates were not about that. You had to know what their arguments were, not what the arguments are for evolutionary theory or the Holocaust happened.
That's right.
And the same thing with here. It's like, I was thinking about this with, I just finished my latest book on conspiracy theories, and I have a whole chapter just on JFK. And, it's like a 10,000 word chapter. And this is like 0.01% of the arguments for JFK. I got Vincent Bugliosi's book, 1,600 pages, in which he lines up every single claim by a JFK assassination conspiracist. And there's thousands of them. And they do the anomaly hunting. Well, okay, how do you explain that this little fragment was, and that Connolly moved this way instead of that way? Or how do you explain the little, the in the shadows? Or why is the guy, this is my favorite one, why was there a guy with an umbrella on the grassy knoll on a sunny day? How do you explain that? Well, that guy, his name is, I think it was James Witt, something Witt, W-I-T-T. Anyway, Earl Morris actually did a 15-minute film on this guy because he finally came forward and said, I was the guy with the umbrella. And here's the story. It's not a gun. There's all these conspiracies about the thing could be converted to a gun and he shot Kennedy, whatever. And that, in fact, he was there to protest Kennedy because Kennedy's father, Joseph Kennedy, was kind of a Nazi sympathizer or a German sympathizer or whatever. And that when Neville Chamberlain came off the plane back to England after meeting with Herr Hitler, and, he showed the piece of paper, Herr Hitler promised he would never take any more territory, and he's holding in his umbrella while he's doing this. So this guy was saying that the umbrella was a sign of protest against appeasement, and that Kennedy, JFK, was appeasing the communists or the Cubans or whatever it was, and he was there to protest. It's like, oh. So, but how long does it take to chase down that one little anomaly? The guy finally came forward and said, yeah, it was me, and here's why I had an umbrella. But there's like 10,000 of those just for the JFK thing.
Even if they believe it. If they believe it, they'll just say, but what about? And move to the next one.
Move to the next one. Right. So your point in this, like which strategy in talking to a denier do you take? It's pretty risky to say, I'm going to go in there and refute all their claims because you better have all of them at the top of your head ready to go because they're ready for you.
That's right. And so the distinction here is in the Cornelia Betsch and Philip Schmid's Nature Human Behavior article in 2019. They found that you really could push back against science deniers with something called technique rebuttal, which is based on the Hufnagel brothers and John Cook and Stephen Lewandowski's idea that there were 5 different tropes of science denial reasoning, belief in conspiracy theories, illogical reasoning, cherry picking, these sorts of things. And that once you learned those tropes, you could attack their reasoning. And then there was also content rebuttal, which is what you were just talking about, what the biologist or the physicist does. And the really fascinating part of that study is that both were equally effective, which means that you don't need to be a biologist to push back against the creationist. You don't need to be a specialist in the content of the theory in order to find a flaw in their reasoning, because they all follow the same blueprint, the same script, just as I had suspected going in there. And so once you'd know that, and the study hadn't been published, it came out in 2019 and I was there in 2018. The study hadn't been published yet. But when I read it, I understood, yeah, that's the right way to approach it. Because, for instance, one of the tropes is the idea that science has to be perfect, that you'd have to prove, what you're saying, that there's, science needs certainty. And if there's not certainty, then anything goes. My belief is just as good as your belief until the day scientists can prove it. Climate deniers use this all the time. Well, that's a flawed piece of reasoning. And if you know coming in that's what they're going to do, then there's a way to push back on that. And on all of these 5 tropes. It's a fascinating paper. I joked at the time that I could have read that thing if my hair were on fire, because it was really the first empirical evidence that you could push back against a science denier.
Now, how would you do
part
that?
Of the
how would you do that verbally?
Disappointment is.
I was going to say, what would you say? Like if I said, I know I've tried this because I've said, that's what the Holocaust deniers did when they didn't, and the immediate response I get is, oh, so you're claiming I'm a Holocaust denier, then they're insulted. So you can't do it that way.
Mm-hmm. There are scripts in the Betsch and Schmid study. That the interesting thing to remember about that study is it was all done online. And it was done with people who were hearing disinformation for the first time. They were the audience. And so my hypothesis was, would this still work if you went after the hardcore deniers, the people who were face to face? The people who had been marinating in disinformation for 10 years, could you, but believed it, right? Could this work against them? There, as I said, your paper was helpful to me because the approach just makes sense, that you have to be calm, you have to be respectful. And so, I mean, what can you say? I'm not sure I can give a script so much as I can express an attitude of, trying to work your way around to say to them, what the question that I asked before, what would change your mind? What could I say to you to change your mind? And if there's nothing that I could say to change your mind, then your view is based on faith. It's not based on evidence. They would, one guy responded to that question by saying, well, just give me proof. I said, well, proof, you don't have proof. Scientists don't have proof. Science is not about proof. And he just seemed shocked, that anybody who was in favor of science would say that. But then, we went on to have a conversation.
So just to clarify, no one made the argument, the Bible says the earth is flat, and that's why I believe it.
Some people did, but they were not the speakers on the stage.
Okay.
There were some of the people who were there who would say, one fellow told me that flat earth was the only account that was consistent with the idea that there was Noah's flood.
Mm. Yeah,
it
my
had to be a
experience
flat
with
surface in order to flood.
Oh, I see. Okay. Yeah, my experience with creationists.
So I did hear that.
Yeah, my experience with creationists is that they were not relying on biblical literalism. I mean, that's what's behind, for sure, the young Earth creationists. But that isn't the case they're trying to make. They're trying to make a scientific case, which I find kind of historically and sociologically interesting, because we live in an age of science, and science has so much prestige culturally, politically, socially, and so on, that it's not enough to just say, well, that's my faith, it's what I believe. And if I didn't believe that, I'd be some other faith, right? There's a sense like, no, it's actually true. So I'm playing with these ideas of different kinds of truths. You and I are talking about empirical, scientific truths, but somebody like who's a Christian that says, well, I believe Jesus died and was raised from the dead. He was resurrected. He died for my sins and so on. That's what I believe. That's what Christian. I wouldn't be a Christian if I didn't believe that, right? And if you said, well, where's the control group, or how do you know it happened? And now maybe centuries ago, people would have said, what are you talking about? This is what we believe. It's just that that's it. That's our truth. But today, a lot of the theists, they actually have arguments. Like, here's the 12 reasons I believe the resurrection happened. The 3 women were there. The tomb was empty. How did they roll away the stone? The guard said he saw him. 3 days later, so-and-so saw Jesus in apparition. There he was. And, they make arguments that I think they're doing because science has a lot of prestige.
I think that's right. I mean, I think that's what that sounds exactly like the flat earthers, right? They were appalled by the idea that I would accuse them that their view was based entirely on faith. They didn't, because then it would be, well, you believe what you believe and I believe what I believe. They didn't want that. They thought that they were actually correct, and that there was a conspiracy controlled by the devil, who was paying off the scientists, the airline pilots, the government officials to withhold the truth about the shape of the earth. And when I asked why would the devil, do this? I did not get a straight answer. This was the ultimate demonstration that people were lying to us, and that if they, could lie to us about that, they could lie to us about anything. And I mean, they were conspiracy theorists about a lot of things. I mean, they tended to have 10 or 20 different conspiracy theories that they believed. Not all of them were Christians, but all of them were conspiracy theorists, and proudly so. They would not recoil from me saying, well, you're just a conspiracy theorist. They would say, yeah, that's right. Anybody here could give you their top 10 conspiracy theories. Why aren't you a conspiracy theorist? That was okay with them. That didn't bother them. The idea that it was completely based on faith, that did bother them.
In other words, it's literally true or empirically true. And then you say, well, what about this and this? Well, that's part of the conspiracy. NASA faked the photographs, or the pilots are paid off, or whatever. But didn't you, if I recall the story, propose an actual flight? You and a flat earther would take a flight over Antarctica or something like that? It's kind of
this was before Branson. Boy, would I love to have had Branson in my back pocket. Though right. He apparently, Branson faked some video of him riding a bike, before he got there on the rocket. So they would just claim the whole thing was faked, I suppose. I see. But here's what happened. One of the speakers, so I like to grab the speakers just when they came off stage. And one of the speakers was a young man who was bright and articulate. And I mean, he reminded me of a top student at, a college where I would teach. He was really quite an impressive speaker. And he was teaching a seminar on how to convert people into flat earth. And his tactics that he was using to convert them were somewhat similar to the same tactics that I was trying to use, to convert them. And so I really wanted to talk to this guy. So he came off the stage and I said, look, I've been at the conference for, a day and a half now. I'm not a flat earther. And I'm going to be writing about this, just, so you know who I am. I'm from Boston. And can I take you to dinner? And I'll buy your dinner, but I want to talk about flat earth the whole time. And he said, let's go. And we had a great conversation in which, this guy was really sharp. And so when I didn't know at what point he was going to get angry and walk away. And so I just started with my toughest question. And my toughest question was, is there any crucial test that could get you to change your mind? Because as I've been here for the last day and a half, everybody says it's based on evidence. But if it's based on evidence and you're really a scientist, you've got to be able to tell me in advance what would be a crucial test. So what would it be? And he said initially, well, I'd have to see it for myself. And I said, well, what does that mean? And he said, I suppose I'd have to go up in a rocket and see the shape of the Earth. And I said, okay, well, I'm not sure I can get you on a rocket. And then he said, well, that wouldn't work anyway, because the window is curved, and maybe there's some kind of an optical illusion through the curved window. Okay, but here's where it got really interesting. I said, because I'd been to the scientific seminar and I knew that they believed that Antarctica was not a continent. It was an ice wall spread out around the perimeter of the Earth to keep the water from falling off. And you couldn't go beyond the ice wall, which is why you couldn't fall off the edge of the Earth. And I said, I believe Antarctica is a continent. It's about, 1,000 miles, maybe a little more across. And you can see it from the air. You think Antarctica is a 24,000 mile long ice wall around the perimeter. And he said, that's right. And I said, so here we've got a test, right? Because if we could fly over Antarctica, and without, to see it, then I would be right. And he said, those flights don't exist. And here I was prepared. I said, oh no. And out of my back pocket, I took a sheet of paper for a flight that was from Chile to New Zealand. And it didn't go, I guess, as I look at a globe now, exactly over, but it was, we didn't have a globe there to test it. And so for our purposes, I guess we both at that time thought, the only way to get from point A to point B would be to go over Antarctica. And he said, and so he looked at the flight and he said, well, have you been on this flight? And I said, no, and neither of you. Why don't we go? Why don't we go? Because I could get on podcasts with all my scientific friends, and I could get on Facebook, and I could raise enough money to pay for both of our tickets. And we could go together. We could film it if you wanted. And what about it? And he said, okay. And he shook my hand. And I thought, oh man, because I knew I could come to you and I could come to, I mean, we could raise, how hard would it be to raise a couple $1,000s to do this? I mean, everybody would be interested, right? And then a couple of minutes into it, we were both thinking, okay, now this is getting real. And I wanted to be sure that he wasn't going to say, oh, the window's curved, something, I was going to raise all that money for the flight and then he was going to dismiss it. So I said, we need a criteria. We need something to measure that's not just, you looking out the window. I said, how about this? I think Antarctica's 1,000 miles across. So, from Chile to New Zealand is, 4,000 miles. I don't know how far it is, but we could get there on one tank of gas. There's no place to stop to refuel in Antarctica. But if you're right, and it's 24,000 miles, we'd have to stop to refuel. So so we could even shut the shades on the window and still see who was right. Because if we got there, we landed and we hadn't stopped for fuel, then I'm right. And he shook again. And I said, oh man, now this is it. This is it, because I knew I was writing this book and I thought, this would be great. And about 3 minutes later, he took it back. And he took it back because he said, how did we know that planes really needed to stop to refuel? And I said, what do you mean they stop to refuel all the time? There's no plane that can go from New York to Beijing. There wasn't at that point. Maybe there is now. They can't do it. And he said, oh, but what if they could? And I said, well, then why do all those planes stop for fuel all the time? And he said, maybe it's a hoax to delude us into thinking that planes have to stop to refuel. At which point I said, so you're telling me that the entire history of air travel since before you and I were born has been a deliberate hoax from the devil, so that the day when you and I are sitting here and I'm trying to find a way to convince you that the earth is actually round, you're going to fall for it. And he said, that's right.
Oh boy. Wow.
And at that point, I had him, right? I could have just gotten up, dropped the mic and leave, right? But we didn't. And what I should have said is, well, I guess it is based on faith then, and put it back in his lap to tell me what would count. But the point was, he was not going to let me box him in on any evidence that would convince him. And yet they do these experiments and don't live by the results. When an experiment goes against them, they walk. I'm sure you've seen Behind the Curve. They walk away from it when the experiment doesn't go their way.
Yeah, for our listeners, really this is you can go on Netflix and watch this Behind the Curve. Beyond the Curve? I forget. Anyway.
Yeah, Behind the Curve.
Yeah, it's a fascinating kind of sociological study of just what it's like to be around those people. And that guy, that I forget his name, the kind of the hero of the film.
Mark Sargent.
Yeah, Mark Sargent. He's like, their god. He's like their superstar. He's like the Carl Sagan of flat earthers or something like that. Yeah. You can kind of see the motivation for him. Like, oh, I have all these adoring fans. And it's almost like a little cult or religious type movement. Yeah. So let's take those principles of talking to flat earthers, because it sounds like such a fringy idea. This is just fun. What's the harm? Well, but the rest of your book is about anti-vaxxers and climate deniers and GMO skeptics and so on. So take the principles you learned there and apply them to some of these other more serious issues.
Okay. So this is all technique rebuttal, right? So again, it's the 5 principles are cherry picking evidence, belief in conspiracy theories, belief in fake experts and denigrating real experts, engaging in illogical reasoning, and insisting that science has to be perfect. That's the blueprint. That's the script that if, COVID deniers, climate deniers, anti-vaxxers, all of them end up using. And if you understand that script, and if you understand, some of the weaknesses in that argument style, then you can use it. One example. This is not an example of a conversation that I entered into, but one that I read about, that I discuss in the book, where people will talk to anti-vaxxers and ask them about the inconsistency in their reasoning, why they're so willing to believe there's a conspiracy between the CDC and the Institute of Health, National Institute of Health, but they're not, that one they believe, but they don't think that there's a conspiracy to get them to believe that the MMR vaccine is, dangerous or, something like that. And so just being able to bore in on something like that and show the inconsistency. But I'll tell you what I actually learned at the Flat Earth Convention is that it's not about any particular technique of reasoning. It's not about any particular script or type of argument or thing that you can say. It's about empathy. So it's about being willing to listen to what the other person has to say, because what I'm convinced actually works to convert people out of science denial is that they change their identity. It's not that they change their belief, they change their identity, and then their belief comes along with it. And this is all anecdotal, okay? It's not only anecdotal because I, did it. It's anecdotal because the accounts that I read of other people doing this are anecdotal accounts where they have used these techniques to talk people out of anti-vax, talk people into getting their COVID shots. People want to be respected and listened to. And the most compelling evidence here comes from the anti-vaxxers, where if you sit them down with a scientist who is, warm and engaging and respectful and listens, they sometimes will change their mind, because what alienates them is the insulting, oh, you're just a denier. How can you believe that? You must be stupid, et cetera, et cetera. That's what really pushes them into the arms of all of these folks at the convention who are just waiting for them to show up, to turn them from somebody who's vaccine hesitant into a vaccine denier, right? They become radicalized when they get around, these other people who start spouting the conspiracy theories, et cetera. So what I actually learned at the Flat Earth Convention is that we need an army of people to engage with science deniers, not like robots to follow some particular, script, but to befriend them. Because I think that what's actually motivating an awful lot of them is the feeling that they're alienated, they're broken in some way. There's been a break between them and what they call the normie culture. And it's easy once that polarization has occurred to start to feel like, well, those people are bad people and they're lying to me. Well, if they're lying to me about this, why don't I know they're not lying about that? So really the moral of my book is we have to talk to one another. We have to talk to people that we disagree with, because I think it's actually the talking that does it. And since I got back from these trips and since I've written the book, I've started, of course, motivated reasoning. I've started to see these examples all over the place. It's how they talk people out of cults. It's how Daryl Davis, the black blues musician who's devoted decades of his life to talking people out of the Ku Klux Klan. There's a book now called Rising Out of Hatred about a rising star in the white supremacy movement who was talked out of it because he was befriended by a group of Jewish students at his college. I think that's what actually is behind it. It's community, it's belonging, it's identity. It's not any particular belief. So if we think that we can go in with some fact or argument that's going to work every time, we can't. I think the only thing that works, and this doesn't work all the time, certainly, but I think the only thing that can work is building trust through personal engagement.
So when you talk about identity, so let's say somebody's in the Ku Klux Klan, what are they identifying as? The book to read here is Rising Out of Hatred, and then Daryl Davis also has a book. I forget what it's called, but Daryl Davis is a good example. He will. I've seen him speak a couple of times, and he tells a story about
meeting his first Ku Klux Klansman that he didn't even know, was in it, but he was playing a gig and sat down at the table, between sets, and this fellow started to talk to him and said something about, it's kind of, amazing that, you sound just like Jerry Lee Lewis, but you're black. And he said, well, where do you think Jerry Lee Lewis got it from? And the guy said, what do you mean? And, so they started talking about the history of blues, started the history of music. And then at a certain point in the conversation, the guy's friend was kind of, elbowing him, come out, tell him who you are. And it turned out he was some very high up person in the Ku Klux Klan. And what Daryl Davis does is he becomes friends with them, which is unbelievable to me, how he even, crosses that. But the slogan that he uses often is, how can you hate me if you don't even know me? And that once people get to know one another, the hatred begins to disappear, and then they're interested in what you have to say. And then he will ask some question, just based on their pattern. They're obviously not trying to convince him to become, join the Ku Klux Klan, but he has gone to Klan meetings and, heard what they have to say. Super smart guy. He will zero in on some particular thing that they've said and then ask a question, which can be very effective once trust has been built. So I don't mean to make it sound like facts and truth are irrelevant to this. They're not. It's that if somebody doesn't trust you, no amount of facts is ever going to work. They have to trust the messenger before they'll do it. And Daryl Davis's famous thing is, people will give him their Ku Klux Klan robes when they leave. He's got about 200 robes.
Oh my God,
he's an
great.
Amazing person.
Yeah.
And I'm not, making the parallel between a Ku Klux Klaner and a science denier, other than to say that empirical beliefs don't just come from facts and reason. They come from who you are. And if who you are is a person who identifies with, a hate movement, your beliefs are going to follow. Empirical beliefs that turn out not to be true, but you think they're true, maybe because you never talk to anybody who contradicts them. But once you begin to trust people who don't believe what you believe, you can change. The other book, the one that I've been recommending to everybody since I read it, is Rising Out of Hatred. Here was a guy who, he didn't just believe it, he was raised in it. He was, his name is Derek Black. He was raised to be the heir apparent in the neo-Nazi movement. His parents, his mother, his father, they ran this website that was, the big, they ran Stormfront, which was the big, website for them. And he was converted once he got away from home and started to be befriended by people who, suddenly he wasn't just surrounded by people who were in the white supremacy movement. And I read those accounts and I think, if they can do that, how come I can't talk somebody into getting their COVID shot? How come I can't talk somebody into giving up flat Earth? I mean, it should be comparatively easy to do. And yet, identity is super strong. Whatever somebody's identity is, they're not going to give it up easily.
I don't know if you saw the movie American History X, I think it was called, about this, these, yeah. I mean, there's that great dinner scene where the mother's boyfriend, Elliot, played by Elliot Gould, is trying to explain, counter the young man's arguments, and he's going on and on about immigrants and, the blacks are taking our jobs and they're, the welfare queens are taking our money, my hard-earned money. And
Ed Norton, right?
Yeah, Ed Norton, right. I mean, he's just so good on this.
Yeah.
But you kind of see how the identity is built up. Who would be in favor of somebody stealing my stuff, taking my jobs? I work hard, and those welfare queens are taking my tax money, and that's not right. Right. So you kind of see how it builds from there. I've seen that with the climate skeptics, so-called climate deniers or skeptics, whatever. What's their identity? Okay, well, they tend to be conservative, so pro-free market, pro-capitalism, free trade, industry, business. This is what America's all about. And you guys are using this climate thing to curtail business. So to them, as I understand it, at least for some of them, it's not about climate change at all. It's about this kind of conspiracy, even if it's not an open conspiracy theory, that there's this kind of conspiracy against the American way of life. And that, big government, socialism, controlling the industry, capitalism and destroying capitalism and so on. That's what it's really about. So to counter that with just saying, well, what about the CO2 gases are up to, 440 parts per million? This is totally irrelevant. These facts are just going to fly right over their heads. It's like, what are you talking about? I'm worried about capitalism.
Because that's not why they believe it. But Jonathan, what did Jonathan Swift say? You can't reason somebody out of something they didn't reason themselves into in the first place. The reason they believe it has nothing to do with the arguments that they're giving you. There was a brilliant paper by, I think her name is Liliana Mason out of Michigan State, where she tested this hypothesis that you're talking about, the difference between identity and ideology. And what she found is that people would, that identity cut deeper than ideology did, which is to say that there was kind of an elegant experiment. She would ask people, well, how happy would you be if you lived next door to, or your daughter were to date, or, whatever the closeness measure was, somebody who, was pro-choice if they were pro-life, or, somebody who was a member of Black Lives Matter if they weren't, so they would go through all the, conservative ideological talking points. But then the other way that she would measure it, that was the control group. The other group was, how happy would you be to live next door to a liberal Democrat? Always, always, always it was worse when you described him as a liberal Democrat, right? When you got the identity tag on it. When it was, what does the person believe? Even though all the beliefs could be liberal democratic beliefs, if you approached it from the point of view of ideology, that was fungible. The identity was not. And the example here that I always think of is those idiots at the Trump rally wearing the shirt that said, I'd rather be a Russian than a Democrat. Just look how far the ideology has changed. The ideology is fungible. What is not is the identity. And so I can't remember the name of the paper, but Liliana Mason really nailed that, which I think is right. And you just said it. It's who you see yourself as a person. And I think that's, by the way, why when you go to a convention, it's so hard to peel somebody off, because it's a love fest. They're getting all the strokes, all the wonderful things. Imagine being a flat earther out in society where, your family won't talk to you and you're going to get kicked out of your church. And, maybe you can't, your boss is angry at you, or, maybe you don't tell people what you believe. And all of a sudden you're surrounded by all these other people who are telling you that you're smart and you belong and you're whole and you're wonderful. That's got to be intoxicating.
Yeah, one of the things I do with creationists, young Earth creationists, who doubt the theory of evolution entirely, is I don't give them a copy of Richard Dawkins' books on evolution. I give them a copy of Francis Collins' book, The Language of God. Because he is the head of the head of the Human Genome Project, head of the National Institute of Health. He's an evangelical born again Christian who, in that last chapter of his book, says, I found Jesus out on a hike and so on, and he accepts the whole thing. He died for my sins. He was resurrected and so on, and he says evolution happened. So there the person can go, oh, that guy's on my team, and he says it's okay to believe this. Okay.
Isn't that interesting?
Kind of opens the door a little bit there. Whereas Dawkins is on the atheist team, and we know we don't trust those atheists.
He'll say anything, right?
That's right.
Yeah, that's the point of view, right?
So for climate scientists, climate deniers, again, what's their identity? Well, it's this kind of pro-capitalism, conservative values, and so on. So there, it's a little harder, but you can sort of show, well, there's green technology to be made a lot. You can make a lot of money on green technology, and instead of looking at this as an ideology, how about as a capitalistic opportunity, to address this problem and make a lot of money, something like that. In other words, I'm trying to tell them you don't have to give up your belief in the American way of life and consumerism and capitalism and so on. You can keep all of that, but just accept this one little thing here. Climate change is happening, and we can do something about it and make more money, or something like that.
Mm-hmm. And I'll go you one better on that. I think that my German shepherds are walking around here now, which is what the noise is.
It's all right.
So I'll go you one better, which is that I think that these sorts of identities are created. Sometimes they come out of nowhere. I don't know where flat Earth came from. I don't know who would be making any money on that, what ideological political interest could be served. But some science denial is whipped by people who do have an interest, the tobacco lobby, the fossil fuel industry, and they will put a lot of effort into polarization and disinformation to convince people, as to be on their side of it. And so so sometimes these identities are created for them. Not every branch of science denial has been politicized, but the ones that have been really politicized. Climate change is one of them. COVID now is one. I just was reading the other day that did you see that poll? I think it was out of the Washington Post, that when you break up the people, have you gotten your COVID vaccine? Or do you refuse to get your COVID vaccine? You break it up by political party, and it came to something like 93% of Democrats said that they'd either gotten it or planned to. Only 4, 5, 6% said that they wouldn't. When you go over to the Republican side, it was 47% said that they would not get it. Now, where does that come from? That was created. That has nothing to do with Republican ideology. I mean, you could even make the argument that, Trump was president when the vaccines were invented. So couldn't he have taken credit for it, even though, maybe not? But I mean, plausibly, could they have spun it that way? They could have. So there's nothing that makes you think, that has to be part of conservative ideology. It was just that the identity was created around, well, we're the sort of people who are against that. And, people can try to explain it to say, well, they don't like mandates. They don't like, big, government telling them what to do. You could try to explain it in that way. I think it's just red team, blue team. This is what people on the red team believe. People on the red team are supposed to believe that we're not supposed to get our COVID vaccines. And I mean, what else could account for it? And you see it again and again, not just on scientific topics, but political topics now too, like Stop the Steal or what really happened on January 6th. It's really appalling the extent to which really any division can be politicized. Moneyed interests, political interests, Russian disinformation is behind a shocking amount of science denial as it comes out of Russian disinformation campaigns.
Well, so let's dissect the liberal versus conservative science denial. I mean, the main meme you hear is, well, conservatives are the science deniers and Democrats are the people of the book. Well, I have this one statistic here of, let's see, this is on creationism. 2012 Gallup poll found that 58% of Republicans believe that God created humans in their present form within the last 10,000 years, and only 5% believe that humans evolved and God had no part in the process. Mm-hmm. What's astonishing, however, are the findings that 41% of Democrats and 39% of independents believe that God created humans in their present form in the last 10,000 years. Mm-hmm. And only 19% of Democrats and independents believe that humans evolved and God had no part of the process. And there was no significant difference between Republicans at 31% and Democrats at 32% in the belief that humans evolved via God-guided processes. So I thought Democrats were the people of the science book, and yet that doesn't always seem to be the case. So
you asked a question that really fascinates me because, and I wanted to devote some time to this in my book, because you do read people who claim that science denial comes from the right and that people, on the left couldn't possibly be science deniers. But I wanted to examine this. I wanted to go after this. And so I looked at anti-vax, which, before COVID came along, before it was polarized, seemed to be kind of equal opportunity science denial. There were people on the left and people on the right. The one that really stuck, the one that I wrote about, the one that was the more interesting case to me was GMOs. I didn't really know much about GMO denial before I, started to investigate it. And what I discovered is that GMO denial is quite virulent on the left as well. Now, when you ask the question, so this is the question that I was obsessed with throughout, this couple of chapters of the book. Is there any case of science denial that you can identify that's primarily from the left? That's kind of like the things that you were talking about with evolution, where the valence flips and it's an example of left-wing science denial, and where the right wing says, no, you guys are all crazy, look at the facts. I'm not sure you can find an example. I'm not sure I can name an example that's like that. But that is not the test. The test of whether there's science denial on the left is whether there are people with denialist beliefs who also have liberal ideology. And I think that is the case. And it's especially the case with GMO denial. And so what I did was I wanted to, study this question, because people are always interested in, why are people science deniers? They've even put them in the fMRI, machine to try to figure out, is there something different about their brain? Are they more risk averse? Are they, do they get, belief surveys? All sorts of ways that people have tried to get, to figure this out. And I think that what I discovered, and the work that I've done, I'm not the only person certainly who studied this, but what it seemed to me is that people can be deniers for different reasons. So vax is a good example. You look at, now I'm talking about anti-vax before, COVID took over the anti-vax movement. You would have people on the right who were anti-vaxxers because they didn't want a government mandate to vaccinate their kids. You had people on the left who were anti-vax because they didn't trust big pharma. So you would have, roughly equal numbers of people who were anti-vax, but they were anti-vax for different reasons. And I went hard after the GMO question because it seemed to me there that I really had the best possible opportunity to show that there was an example where, there were just scads and scads of people on the left who believed it. And as it turned out, there are scads and scads of people on the left who are GMO deniers. It also turns out that there are scads of people on the right who are GMO deniers. So I don't think that this is an instance of something that's been politicized, like COVID or like climate change, but it is one where just unfortunately a majority of humanity are deniers about GMOs. And what I mean by that is that there is no scientific study that has ever shown that GMO foods are unsafe to eat. And yet, when you survey people on this, they will claim that they are unsafe to eat. And the gap between the consensus of scientific opinion and lay opinion is 51 percentage points, which is an even greater gap than on climate change. I mean, that is just enormous. So the interesting gap to me is not between left-right on that issue. It's between the scientific consensus and the lay consensus, which is just appalling.
Yeah, so here, maybe the underlying commonality is skepticism of big, powerful agencies, corporations, departments, people. It's power. So, my next big book is on conspiracies. This is an underlying theme amongst most conspiracy theories conspiracy theorists is that somebody has power, I don't. How did they get it? What are they doing with that power? So it could be government, 9/11 inside job by the Bush administration, but it could be corporations. I mean, you rarely hear GMOs discussed without the word Monsanto being inserted in there as an insult. Right. Like, it's just like given. Right. We all know Monsanto is evil. We can let Bill Maher be our type specimen here, because there was a big controversy amongst atheists, skeptics, humanists, because Richard Dawkins gave Bill Maher his, annual, greatest atheist of the year award or whatever it is, and then right after that, Maher had some riff on his show about, vaccines. I'm not getting vaccines. And this is long before COVID. I don't trust those, big corporations, big pharma, and the government can't tell me what to do. And, the whole thing. And it's like, uh-oh. This guy is pro-science. Well, but this is the interesting thing. People can be pro-science. Republicans, they're not. They're happy to go to the doctor. They fly at 35,000 feet. They trust the engineers and mathematicians that built the planes and whatnot. 99% of science is totally acceptable. It's only these few points where it intersects with something that is deep part of my identity, and there I'm going to push back. So it's not global science denial. It's a very specifically targeted.
You're right, and that's I call them cafeteria skeptics. Right? They will be skeptical about the things that they want. They'll pick it. No, that's fine. That's fine. That's fine. Oh no, I don't like that. So I've never met anybody who's anti-science, and I don't just mean that they won't call themselves anti-science. I mean, I've never actually met anybody who's anti-science. I mean, maybe Ted Kaczynski, right? But I've never met him. But anti-science. But even the flat earthers. I mean, they flew there on planes. They ate at the restaurant. They would have insisted that their milk be pasteurized. The different. I mean, science was fine with them, just not these particular areas that they didn't trust. Yeah, I think you're right about that.
Another area you didn't address that I've been following is what I call cognitive creationism, where evolution only happens from the neck down, and there I see a pretty strong kind of liberal bias against evolutionary psychology, and every evolutionary psychologist will tell you, oh yeah, we're an equal opportunity offender. Conservatives don't like us because we're pro-evolution, and liberals don't like us because, we're saying that, that it isn't a blank slate. We can't just socially engineer everything we want. You can't be any gender you want. You can't be any intelligence, whatever. It's not a blank slate. And, Steve Pinker wrote an entire book on that, The Blank Slate, I highly recommend. He just piles up, and there the bias seems pretty strongly more liberal against that particular kind of science. And again, they accept evolutionary theory. They just feel, they fear, here's the deeper fear, I think, is that if genetics and biology, neurochemistry and so on really makes a difference, a powerful difference, then maybe we can't socially engineer a fair and just society because certain things are just determined, which Pinker makes the point. That's the exact opposite of what's the case. Once you understand the biology underneath human behavior, then you can actually do something about it by tweaking the social variables that are, based on human nature, good human nature. Anyway, I see that as one of these kind of another liberal.
I've always been interested in, I got started in philosophy of social science because I thought that if we were denying certain facts about human behavior, how could we ever have the social engineering, to get past them? I mean, don't we really need to know whether guns deter crime or whether the death penalty works? I mean, shouldn't we actually have some data on these questions before they go to Congress and we're making laws about it? So I'm anti-ideology. I don't like ideology from the right or the left determining what we should believe is true, and how we're conducting our scientific inquiry. I didn't write about evolutionary psychology in this book. I do have some things to say about it in some earlier work, though I haven't kept up on it enough to know much more. The cutting edge work that's going on right now.
Yeah, well, they've done a lot. I mean, the early criticisms, like by Stephen Jay Gould and Richard Lewontin and so on, like really against sociobiology, it was called at the time in the 70s, and then in the 80s, there was the science was pretty new, and these evolutionary psychologists were still trying to figure out how can we test these hypotheses. Well, they do that pretty well now. I think they make the case for that. But like David Buss's new book on when men behave badly, I just had him on the podcast. Super interesting stuff. But his point is that if you don't understand the difference between men and women's sexual psychology, we're never going to solve these problems of why sexual assault happens and what we can do about it socially and culturally. If it's just totally random, then why is it that 99% of sexual violence is males against females? Or when it's male on male, it's in a prison or something artificial like that. Otherwise, right. And so you got to understand human nature that way. I don't want to go off on that because that's not part of your book. And I do have a heart out here.
David Buss, I'll read it.
David. Yeah, no, it's really quite good. But so just I do have a heart out here. So let's just kind of wrap it up and give us. We've been going an hour and a half here. It's super interesting stuff. So just kind of give us a general wrap up. What do you recommend to listeners that are going to the family dinner this weekend and crazy Uncle Bob is going to bring up QAnon, or he's going to tell me that the vaccines are all a bunch of bullshit by Bill Gates to chip us all, or he's, the story. What do I say? Do I just keep my mouth shut?
I think you should never keep your mouth shut. I think that having those kind of conversations with family members is the best thing that you could do, because the barrier that you face when you're going out to talk to a science denier is they don't know you. And why should they trust you? And especially if it's just going to be a one-off, just kind of a hit and run, you meet them, you try to convert them, and but if they don't like it, they walk away. That's almost never going to work. When people get converted, they can get converted by people that they know. And there has been some empirical work on this. By some of the same folks who brought you the backfire effect, which wasn't replicated, but they understand that and actually moved on and did some other work, which found that you can appeal to consensus. That's a very effective tactic, especially with conservatives when you're talking about climate change. Graphs work better than text. So there are things that you can do. But the main thing you can do is just engage. The people who love you, the people who trust you, don't get angry, don't get upset. Listen to what they have to say. You have to plant the seed, and then you have to water the seed. That's how I think of it. That's why it's so hard to go to the Flat Earth Convention and for me to convince them or them to convince me, because you don't have time to see that seed come up. But you have to. The fellow that was up on the stage who was trying to convert people to Flat Earth, he used the same language. He said, when you're running a street clinic, your job is to plant the seed, and then tell them to go home and start to Google some things on YouTube, and then we'll get them. So maybe that's the thing, right? Maybe at the Thanksgiving dinner, when you're talking to crazy Uncle Bob, plant the seed, and then give them some resources to look up, and maybe they'll look at them. You can't convince anybody. They'll have to convince themselves, but you can create an opportunity for them to convince themselves if you show them love. Another book that I just read recently that I really enjoyed was called The Cult of Trump, where the author is a former Moonie. And he understands cults extremely well because he was in one. And of course, the argument in the book is that MAGA is a cult. But the part of the book that I was most interested in is where he talks about how they get people out of cults. And it's the same way they get them into it. It's love and respect and listening and valuing the other person. So, you can't yell at Uncle Bob. You got to listen to Uncle Bob.
Good advice, Lee. We'll put that to the test, and after Thanksgiving, we'll have you back on the show to see how that went. All right, let's wrap it up. And just what's next on your research writing plate?
I am right now doing publicity for the last book, and I'm thinking about all the things that I left out of the book that I just wrote. And I'm not sure whether this is my next book or an article or something else, but the thing that I'm thinking of the most these days is disinformation. Disinformation is intentionally created. And does that mean that the science deniers are in some sense victims? And we're out there playing whack-a-mole with the victims, but what are we doing to stop the disinformation from being created and amplified. That's the thing that I'm worrying about a lot now, because of course the problem with science denial is that it has metastasized to become reality denial. The 5 tropes of reasoning that I was talking about earlier, it's the same 5 tropes that they're using for Stop the Steal and for the January 6th insurrection. It's the same thing. Okay. And so we don't have time to go talk individually to every single person, the millions of people who, believe QAnon, et cetera. So how do we shut off the flow of disinformation? That's what I'm really worried about these days. And if you have good ideas on your work was so important to me in the book that I just wrote. So if you've got any work on disinformation, you got to tell me, because this will help me to get ready for my next thing.